talk to you about one of the projects that I've been running over the last couple of years. So how many of us either know someone or are someone who has type 1 diabetes? Friend, family, brother, sister, cousin, someone at school? Well, we're not alone. Over 400,000 people in the UK have type 1 diabetes diagnosis, and that rate is exponentially increasing, and we're not quite sure why. Perhaps you might even know Max, not the Vice-Chancellor. I want to tell you a little story about Max and why it's important to listen to his story. Max is 14 years old and he lives at home with his mum and dad. He's really, really sporty. Any sport you can imagine, he is absolutely into it. When he was 13, so just last year, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And he found it really difficult to transition to that diagnosis because type 1 diabetes means you have to count carbohydrates, read food labels, avoid certain foods when you really want them, eat certain foods when you really don't, give yourself daily insulin injections, and test your blood sugars regularly several times a day. And you can imagine for a 14-year-old, 13-year-old, this is really difficult to get your head around when you've previously never had to do things like this before. The other thing that Max found really difficult was he used to love eating with his friends and family. He'd love nothing more than going to Pizza Express on a Friday night with his friends after school, and he really enjoyed that kind of independence and that social element of eating. But since he's had his diagnosis, he finds that he's very self-conscious because he's having to give his injection and insulin and do his blood tests in front of people at the dinner table. And how many of us did not like feeling different at the age of 13 and 14? I again will put my hand up to that. Because of these difficulties, he started to withdraw a little bit. He's spending less time with his friends and he's eating upstairs at meal times instead of with his family because he feels so self-conscious. I mentioned at the start that Max is also really sporty, and he's 13, 14, so it's not surprising he has a smartphone and he follows lots of sports celebrities and influencers on his smartphone. And again, those of us who are parents know that most of our children and young people do that regardless of a type 1 diagnosis. Part of the problem that Max has is when he follows these people on Instagram, they're telling him, eat healthy, eat clean, follow a calorie-controlled diet, hit the gym every day, work out every day. And he wants to be like them. That's what he wants to do. But he's got this type 1 diagnosis, and it feels quite conflicting to him, especially when his dietitians, his nurses, his doctors, and his parents are making him eat things like jelly babies when he has a hypo, when his blood sugars are low. And he finds this mixed messaging really, really confusing. The other thing about Max is that he was at that cusp of independence, 13, 14, he was going out for dinner and all these sorts of things. And suddenly his parents are way more involved in his life than he ever wanted them to be. He feels like he's taking a step back and they're babying him a little bit, and he's getting really frustrated about that. So he's finding it challenging to reconcile the old Max with the new Max who has type 1 diabetes. And unsurprisingly, his parents are worried about him. They're worried about him withdrawing, they're worried about his eating habits, and they're worried about his social media use. But whenever they try and express any concerns with Max, it ends in an argument. And again, how many of us can say that we can communicate with our children without things blowing up and out of control? His parents were kind of at the end of their tether until they saw a research project on this very topic. So our team at the University of Surrey were awarded funding by Diabetes UK to develop a parenting intervention to help enable them to support their children to have a better relationship with food, weight, and body image in the face of having a type 1 diabetes diagnosis. Now, some of you might watch Coronation Street, and other soaps are available, but there is a story about diabulimia, which is the extreme end of disordered eating within type 1 diabetes, because the thing about insulin is that it does make you gain weight. So children and young people at that cusp of adolescence do learn that if they misuse their insulin, they are likely to gain weight. So you can imagine, with everything that goes on with a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, getting fat is probably one of the big concerns for children and young people, and they've essentially been given a tool to stop that happening. But the long-term consequences of that can be hugely problematic. So what did we do? We spoke to lots of families like Max, about their needs and what was missing from current care. We also spoke to dietitians, doctors, nurses and psychologists who worked with people like Max to find out what they wanted their families to know and be aware of. And we created what we're calling the intervention, the priority trial. And this intervention included workshops, 4 hours over 2 workshops, and they were run in groups and online so parents could learn from each other. We also had downloadable website materials and blogs written by families for families sharing their concerns. So this is a really nice kind of toolkit that we had for families. And the intervention covered some of those topics that we knew were important that we spoke about for Max: the use of social media, how do we communicate effectively with our children, our parenting styles and how that can sometimes result in conflict, when food is more than fuel, which is really important to think about. There's a social element of food which we can lose when we're thinking about our type 1 diabetes. We challenge perfectionism and perfectionist trait and how blood glucose is never stable, even if you don't have a diagnosis for type 1 diabetes. And finally, we wrapped up with knowing the signs and symptoms of disordered eating in type 1 diabetes. So what we did was we recruited from 8 NHS trusts, 89 families. And so when a family was referred to our study, half of them were given immediate access to the interventions. They were booked into a group workshop and they were given access to the website. And the other half of our families were told that they would have the intervention in 3 months' time. This is so that we had what we call a control group. And this was randomly done. It's a bit like tossing a coin, so there's no bias involved from our part. We also monitored them for 3 months. So we looked at what we call baseline assessments, so before any of the intervention was offered, and at 1 and 3 months later. And we looked at things like parent quality of life and well-being, child eating behaviours, disordered eating behaviours specifically, as well as some of those diabetes distress markers. What did we find? So thankfully, we found that in the parents and the families who received the intervention, their well-being improved and the rates of disordered eating reduced, as did things like emotional undereating and emotional overeating in children and young people. Children also responded to food satiety better, so they could tell when they were feeling full, which is a really good marker of less disordered eating. We also had interviews with our families to find out what they liked about the intervention and what might need to change. And one of the overwhelming responses was just being with other families and talking about their concerns and the strategies that's worked well and not so well for these people. So what are we planning on doing next? Well, this intervention was a small scale, so it was a feasibility study. We want to know if we can and how we should roll this out nationally. So we'll be seeking follow-on funding to take this work across the UK to help more families like Max so that we can see the same benefits. And really, why is Max's study so important? Well, we know that disordered diabetes is really common. We said at the beginning, over 400,000 people have diabetes, type 1 diabetes. And actually, a third of those people with type 1 diabetes go on to have disordered eating. So that's quite a huge number of people that we could be affecting change for. And one of the issues is that there are no prevention strategies worldwide. This is the first study which is looking at prevention. Everything else looks at treating people when they're seriously unwell with this diagnosis. So it's important at that level to get it right. The other thing to say is the all-party parliamentary group for type 1 disordered eating has been set up. So in January this year, I was invited to speak to Theresa May, who herself has type 1 diabetes, and George Howarth, who lost a child to the consequences of eating disorders within type 1 diabetes, to give evidence on the prevention strategies. Because if we can get these strategies right and encourage children and young people to have a healthy relationship with their own bodies, their self-esteem is likely to be increased, their acceptance of food and healthy lifestyle behaviours are more likely, and their overall psychological well-being is more likely to be improved longer term, not just in childhood. So we have a window of opportunity to really maximise the benefit. I would say if you're interested in helping out, what can you do? If you yourself have type 1 diabetes generally, because we work across conditions, come and talk to me. What else are we missing from the evidence? What else are we missing from clinical care? Because I think together we can really make improvements in everyone's lives with diabetes. Thank you.